if this celestial Jesus was inserted into history in the Roman Empire, did we have anything similar to that outside of the Roman Empire? Did we have any other Christian groups who weren't living under Roman rule, who tried to historicize this messianic figure the same way that we see like in the Gospel of Mark?
Yeah, we have some evidence of that. Unfortunately, it's not early enough evidence to be really confident as to when it arose, but it's still relevant because it's a good question how a completely different group of Christians would put Jesus in a completely different historical period. You still have to explain that. That's easier to explain if there was no historical Jesus to begin with. And what I'm talking about is when we get to the Talmud and we have some support in the Christian writer Epiphanius, it's clear that the Babylonian Talmud, which is compiled by rabbis outside the Roman Empire, just east of the Roman Empire, the only version of Christianity they knew, the only version that they were fighting against, actually put the story of Jesus, the historical Jesus, 100 years earlier. They put it under Alexander Jannaeus, where he's executed by stoning in the city of Joppa, and it's under the occasion of the Seleucids, the Greek rulers at the time, the Greek conquerors. And whereas within the Roman Empire, when Jesus was historicized, they used the Romans instead of the Greeks, which makes logical sense. You say if you want to have a social, political, mythical commentary on your current political reality, your current political reality is Romans, so you would put it in the Roman period. So they put it under Pilate. But outside the Roman Empire, it appears that the Christians out there, or at least some groups of Christians out there, put it in 100 years earlier under the Greek occupation, because the Greek occupation was more relevant to people outside the Roman Empire, because the Romans didn't have influence there directly. But whereas the Greek influence still remained, even though the Greeks weren't in charge, it was controlled by Persians at the time. The influence of Greek culture and Greek history was still significant there, and it was still important to them. So yeah, we have this other group of Christians that put the execution of Jesus and his resurrection 100 years earlier in 70s BC. And then inside the empire, we've got, of course, all the texts that we're familiar with that survived place him in the 30s AD. So we've got that 100-year gap between them. That had to have come from somewhere, right? So who decided to move? Either they decided to move what period Jesus was, lived and died in, or both groups are separately deciding where to put him. And if you don't have a historical Jesus to begin with, then of course both groups could make their own decision as to where they're going to put him, essentially. Either way, you've got to explain this strange fact that this groups of Christians that were imagining Jesus lived and died in a completely different century.
Nice. So it looks like Christians were making multiple attempts at taking this character and placing him in history, depending on what was important to the particular group of Christians at the time.
Yeah, and there was even like some early confusion as to whether they wanted to put it under Pontius Pilate or under Claudius, right? So these are two different, so it's under Tiberius or under Claudius, different emperors. So you have some hints of different groups within the Roman Empire were leaning towards the Claudius state, but the ones that won out and the version of the text that we get mostly have decided that they're going to put it under Pontius Pilate, which means under Tiberius. And so you see, yeah, you do see some of this debate as to, well, where do we want him to be exactly? And that's a weird sequence of events. If there was a historical Jesus, that should have been the story everywhere, right? Like maybe they would, change exactly what Jesus did or whatever, like the myths would be different, but you wouldn't move him to a completely different century or even a different decade. So we do have some of the evidence of this disagreement as to where we're supposed to put the myth of Jesus.
Yeah. So, or maybe he kind of just kept coming back, sort of like whack-a-mole. He pops up here and he pops up there, and a few decades later, he does
we
it
don't.
again.
We don't have any evidence of that specific belief, though. So there's no one who thinks he came back multiple times. We don't have a text that says, well, he was there during Jannaeus and then he was there. That would be a plausible sequence of events. It's just not one that we have any evidence of.